We're going to jump right into our study for this morning, and the goal for this week is to cover chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis. I appreciate Scott for covering for me last week while I was out of town. I mentioned the first week that what I'd like to start each class with is a little bit of review, just to try to commit or recommit some of these things to memory. So that's what we're going to do, just maybe 5 minutes worth of recall. So anybody that wants to answer this, I'm not going to single anybody out, but let's just kind of try to do this together. So let's start with the days of creation. We're going to work through them all 6 in order. First day of creation, God creates what? The heavens and the earth. Okay. What? Anything else? Let there be light. Okay, so light and the creation of the heavens and the earth. Day 2. What does he do on day 2? Okay, the expanse. Okay, what does that mean exactly? And what does he do with the expanse? Yeah, there's a separation. Yeah, visuals are encouraged too. If you're good with sign language or nonverbals, that's great. Yeah, so there's a separation. The waters below, the expanse or the firmament from the waters above. So you have the skies and the seas. Okay, how about day 3? What does God do on day 3?
Seas and dry land.
Okay, he continues this thing, and he does sort of this thing. Yeah, there's separation. The water below the sky, the firmament, he separates water from land, and then on that land, plant life starts to grow. That's day 3. How about day 4? Okay, sun, moon, stars. You guys are really good, getting really good at the nonverbal thing. I think that's going to be some of your things. Okay, so sun, moon, and stars. And remember the form of this, or the kind of the parallels of this. God forms 3 things on 3 consecutive days, and then days 4, 5, and 6, he fills those forms. So he forms the heavens and the earth, day 1. Day 4, he fills them with sun, moon, and stars. He forms light on day 1. Day 4, he introduces the actual givers of light or bringers of light. Okay, day 5, what does God do?
Sea creatures and birds.
Okay, so the same form that he created on day 2, separating the water from the heavens, he then goes back and he fills those with sea creatures, fish, swimming things, and then he fills the sky or the heavens with birds. Very good. And then day 6, creeping things, animals, so he's filling the land that he brought forth on day 3, and then what else? Mankind. Okay, so he creates man in his image on day 6, and then day 7, of course, he rests. Let's talk about this too. From chapters 1 and 2, 2 purposes are given for marriage. I'm going to use the words that are used in your lesson material. So 2 purposes for marriage that we see in the text. Anybody? Ryan? Can I just point out the irony that the unmarried guy is answering this question? Come on, people! Like those of you that have been married for 50 years, I want your expertise on this. Okay, so what was it, Ryan?
Multiplication and companionship.
Okay, multiplication and companionship. It's not good that man should be alone and then fill the earth and subdue it, that sort of thing. So those 2 purposes are identified in chapters 1 and 2. Very good. Okay, so chapter 3, let's talk about the consequences of sin. There are judgments that are given against the serpent, against the man and the woman, and let's just briefly kind of hit those. What are the consequences for the serpent? You don't have to name them all, even just 1 or 2 is fine.
Crawl on his belly and eat dust.
Okay, crawl on his belly, eat dust. Anita?
Enmity between man and
Okay, good. So kind of those 2 main things. He's going to crawl on his belly, he's going to be cursed, and then there's going to be enmity between the serpent and the woman, and then their seeds especially. Scott did a good job last week of pointing out how that becomes a theme that's going to be traced all the way through, not just Genesis, but all the way through Scripture. So this week when we talk about Noah, pay attention to the seed of the serpent and what that looks like and how that seed acts. And then pay attention to the seed of the woman and what that looks like and how that acts. Okay, what are the judgments against the man and the woman?
A man will have to till the ground after work.
Good, so work is going to be a lot harder now. He's going to have to do it with the sweat of his brow. The ground's not going to be as fruitful. It's going to produce thorns and thistles. Very good. And the woman? Okay, so childbirth is going to become a lot more painful. It's going to, whatever pain was there, if there was pain there, it's going to be multiplied is the language. Anything else? Okay. All right. And then last thing, let's talk about the seventh descendant from Adam through Cain and then through Seth. Who is Cain's? Excuse me. Who's the seventh through Cain? Anybody remember? Lamech. Yeah, good. Scott gave us a good mnemonic device. It's Lamech because he's lame. Okay, so Lamech is the seventh through Cain. Who's the seventh through Seth? Enoch. All right. If you know anything about Lamech, what is he known for in the Bible? Bruce.
Well, he had multiple wives, and then we read about the second murder, the second killing.
Okay, good. So he's the first polygamist, and he also kills a kid. Like he's beating up children. Maybe not children, overstating it, but you get the picture that Lamech is not. The descendants through Cain are not people that walk after God. Enoch, on the other hand, does walk with God. What do we know about Enoch?
He didn't die.
Yeah, in this chapter, in chapter 5, this chapter that's full of so-and-so was born, and then he begot so-and-so, and then he died. Enoch is the one exception to that, because he's the only one that doesn't die. And he doesn't die because he walks with God. So keep that thought in mind. All right, so chapter 6. Chapter 6, let's get into this. And notice, let's trace some of these themes in chapter 6. So let's start out just by talking about the state of the world at that time. What are some of the descriptions of the world in Noah's day? Cindy, yes ma'am.
The thoughts of men were continually evil.
Okay, good. So take a note of this, verse 5, because the language here, just listen to this. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. I mean, if you wanted to make a stronger statement about the evil in the world, could you do that? Like, how could you possibly say it could get any worse than it is in verse 5? I think this is really helpful because, we look around and it's not uncommon to hear conversation today, even among Christians, like, man, the world's just getting worse and worse and worse, and I don't know that it's ever been this bad. Yeah, it has. It's actually been, I think, far worse. According to the language of verse 5. Anything else in the text that kind of keys us into the moral corruption of the world in Noah's day? Anita, yes ma'am?
The Lord was grief. He suffered grief that he even made man.
Okay. Yeah, he's sorry that he made mankind. I mean, this part of creation that was in his image, that was kind of like the thing that brought everything together, and he set over in charge of taking care of everything. He was grieved, and he was going to start over. So, yeah, very good. Let's see. Phil, yes sir.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in verse 4, because he said the sons of God came into the daughters of men. We pointed out last week that Cain had after his image, and Seth had after his image, but this was based on God, and this was based on carnal.
Okay.
And so the daughters of men marrying in with the sons of God. I hadn't seen this since this morning, but it's sort of like the Israelites later on intermarrying with the Canaanites. That's what I saw here.
Okay.
That's where the evil came from, that they no longer focused totally on God, that their minds shifted over to the men and the Philistine part.
Good.
I'm not sure that's what it says, but I saw that this morning. That's where I went to. So.
Good. I'll come back to that here in just a second. Yes, sir, Eddie.
I think the most disheartening thing is verse 7.
Okay.
said, I will destroy them. It's something he took time to create and to bring forth, and all of a sudden eventually he says, I'm done.
Good. Yeah, I mean, just imagine, I like the weight of reading those words from the Lord, of all the things that God could say. I'm sorry that I've made them. I mean, just devastating. To hear that from your Creator, that you've departed so far from your purpose that he's basically just saying, I shouldn't have even done this in the first place. It was a mistake. I'm going to go back and I'm going to do this again. Now, I think that also introduces us into another theme that shows, again, God's ability to not just to create, but to recreate. There's a lot of overlap, or there's a lot of parallel between chapter 1, creation, and what's going to happen after the flood. It's almost like the flood narrative is like the antithesis of chapters 1 and 2. But then after the flood, when we get into chapters 8 and 9, we see some things that are sort of parallel to chapters 1 and 2. So God is going back and he's recreating, he's starting things over. But we see just how devastating sin is. I mean, last week Scott mentioned how, one sin in the garden, just taking a piece of fruit that was forbidden, something that might seem so insignificant. And then the very next chapter, what we see is, well, from that we see blame, we see trying to justify behavior, all kinds of other things. And then in the very next chapter, we see murder coming onto the scene, we see anger, all kinds of things like that. In other words, it doesn't take long for sin to just wreck everything. So it's really no surprise that by the time we get to chapter 6, it's not just wreaking havoc, it's destroying the world. I mean, all the descriptions that we read, verse 11 is another one of those. The earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. 3 times in 2 verses he uses this word corrupt. And that's the devastation of sin. So if we're ever inclined to think that we can dabble in sin and it's not really going to do much damage, Genesis 6, I think, is the kind of text that should wake us up. Okay, so now I want to come back to what Phil says. So this sons of God, daughters of men thing, there are some different views on that. Some of them are trippier than others. But I think the best way to think of this is what Phil mentioned, which is what you have here is kind of an extension of the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. The sons of God are people who were following God. I mean, just like in the New Testament, sons of God is a phrase that's used to describe Christians. So you have godly people, godly men specifically, who were looking at women of the world, the daughters of men, who were appealing to them because of their flesh, their physical appearance. They put more stock in that than they did in their relationship with God. And so it seems like that is connected to the spread of evil on the earth. So I think to that point, it even speaks to us about how important it is for us to be careful to guard ourselves about who we're around, who we make close relationships with, friendships, marriages, all those kinds of things. Okay, so let's talk about the opposite of that. In the midst of all of this evil, we're introduced to this man named Noah. Tell me what you learn about Noah from chapter 6. How is Noah described?
Described as righteous.
Righteous, okay, good. Righteous or blameless, some versions say. What else, Bruce? Yes, sir.
Well, it's kind of like similar to Job, had that reputation, it seems like, being that type of a man.
Okay, good. So maybe a reputation for this. Anything else that you all noticed, Cindy? Yes, ma'am.
He had found favor in God's eyes.
Good. Yeah, that's a really important concept too. He found favor, or some versions I think use the word grace in God's eyes. He's blameless. So does that, by the way, does that remind you of anybody else that we've noticed in Genesis so far? Anybody who's described as blameless or righteous? Okay. Good. Yeah, both of them are righteous or blameless. Both of them walk with God. And notice this, as a result of that, in a chapter that is full of death, these are the guys that get to live. Enoch walks with God, he's blameless, and while everybody else on the planet is living their days and dying, no matter how long they live, Enoch doesn't die. Noah is righteous, he's blameless, he walks with God, and on a planet that's about to be wiped out, he doesn't die, and those who listen to him don't die because he's someone who's righteous, who walks with God. So, see any parallels to us? Of course, I think the idea there is that we walk with God, and that's going to lead to life when everything else is falling apart. Yes, sir, Tim.
This is such a simple story. It's so plain and clear, and it reminds us of sermons that go back to just the simplicity of the ark and what Noah did. But the things that I'm seeing sometimes today is we're saved, and it doesn't matter what we do, it doesn't matter how righteous we are, it's all by grace. Well, we see grace involved here, that he wasn't perfect, but God sees our actions and knows those that are righteous and will follow him. So we can never get this idea of, well, it doesn't matter about our works here on earth at all. And I've seen someone just quote that not long ago, a preacher actually. And it's surprising because the Bible says, whoever fears God and worketh righteousness is accepted by him. He's the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. And they say, well, it doesn't matter about our works at all. Well, Noah had to have a certain amount of righteousness in him to find favor with God for him to then be saved by grace.
Good. And let's just build on that a little bit. So this idea that it wasn't just grace from God that saved Noah, independent of Noah's behavior. When Noah is identified as a man of faith in Hebrews 11, what is it that Noah does that is used by the Hebrew writer as the example of faith? What does Noah do? Stan?
Preached to the people, trying to warn them for 100 years.
Okay. So there's a part of that that goes along with this too, but specifically in Hebrews 11, what's the thing that the writer identifies? Tim?
Yeah, when the Bible says in this text, it says, thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him, so he did.
Okay, good. And in the words of the Hebrew writer, he says, by faith Noah prepared an ark for the salvation, or in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. So you see kind of all those things that Tim's mentioning working together. There's grace from God to give him instructions in the first place. There's reverence from Noah that says, this is the Almighty, this is my Creator, and whatever he says is going to happen, so I've got to listen to it. And so in reverence, what does he do? He follows these instructions. Let's talk about those instructions for a little bit. Go ahead, Scott. Yes.
Yeah. So it's grace through faith. It's always been grace through faith. Not just grace, not just faith. Definitely not by just our works. It's grace through faith. And that's what Paul says in all the rest of the New Testament writers. So what I love about the example of Noah is that God did name him as a righteous person. That's a huge distinction. He doesn't just drop that in Scripture lightly. Found favor in God's eyes. This is the stuff like, David was a man after God's own heart. Well, he was a deeply flawed man, so what was it about David that was so special? It's because he was willing to repent he was willing to obey God in whatever. Even when he had messed up, he came back and I want to do the right thing. Noah was that guy. He was willing to do what God said. Thus, we get a great description of what faith looks like.
Very good. So by grace through faith, absolutely. And the grace of God, if anything, compels us to embrace reverence, to embrace faith, to embrace obedience to him. So in Noah's life, what that looks like, at least primarily what we see, obviously there's a lot of day-to-day that we don't read about in detail, but in terms of building this ark, preparing this thing, what are some of the specifics? Give me some of the details of this ark that you picked up on in the text. Stan, yes, sir.
It's got to be made of gopher wood.
Okay. So there's a specific kind of material that's going to be used, gopher wood. Bruce, yes, sir.
I think it's kind of interesting too. It says it's covered with pitch, and we talked about pitch and fossil fuels. Well, this was before the fossil, so there was that on the earth and readily available before the flood came about.
Good.
So there was a specific material to cover the wood.
Okay, so gopher wood, cover it with pitch. You got multiple levels to it. You got a window. You got a door. What are the dimensions of this roughly? For all you math nerds out there. Anita, go ahead.
450 by 75 by 45 feet.
Okay, 450 feet. For reference, think about a football field. Football field is 300 feet long, 100 yards long. So this is a football field and a half long. And it's 45 feet tall and then 75 feet wide. This is a massive piece of furniture that Noah puts together. So all these points, the good points have been made about obedience, reverence for God, preparing, working with God. There's a lot that has to go into this. Now, who's on the ark with Noah, and what is on the ark with Noah? Let's touch on that quickly. Who and what?
Family.
Okay, Tanya.
His family, and then every species of animal, 2 by 2.
Oh.
Male and female.
Okay, so his family, we've got 8 souls. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons. What are their names? Good. Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And then their wives. So 8 altogether. And then animals, 2 of every kind, a male and a female. There's an exception to that, though. Phil?
Instead of the clean animals, so there's something to sacrifice later.
Good. So this clean animals you had more of because not all of them are going to be there for procreation. Some of them are going to be there for sacrifice. Very good. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the flood itself. How many days and nights does it rain on the earth? 40 days and nights. How many days does the water prevail on the earth? I think some of you said it. 150 days before it starts to subside. And then you've got a couple of time markers based on Noah's lifespan. Look at verse 11, chapter 7, verse 11. The 600th year of Noah's life, the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. That's when the floodgates open. And then look at chapter 8, compare that to chapter 8, verse 14. The 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, this is in the 601st year, the earth was dry. So Noah and his family are on this ark for a year and 10 days. Just kind of phenomenal to imagine what that would be like. But it just gives you a little bit of a sense of the scale of this. Sometimes people will try to make the case that this was ancient literature that was kind of magnifying a local flood and making it bigger than what it was. No, this is a global flood. The water covers the tops of the mountains. Everything dies. So it's pretty clear from the text that this is a flood, the scale of which was utter devastation. Bruce, yes, sir.
I think it's kind of interesting. It seems like in chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, Noah and his family were on the ark, and then the animals came in. It wasn't like Noah and the boys were out gathering up all these animals. God sent the animals there. And so it's kind of interesting that, God's natural creation does what he says to do without a lot of pushback or whatever.
Okay, good. And this even goes back, Tim made a comment earlier, I think, about the language that says, talks about God commanding things. I think Tim mentioned it, or somebody touched on that. But that's one of the things that's mentioned in 7:18 or 7:16. Those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and the Lord closed it behind him. So, I mean, you have this kind of this clear theme that everything that listens to God, everyone that listens to God is going to live. God is not a tyrant who's trying to just like destroy everything for the sake of getting some sort of sadistic pleasure out of it. He's trying to preserve life. The whole time that he's giving these instructions to Noah, I think Stan mentioned other texts that talk about Noah being a preacher of righteousness. People had a chance to listen to this and presumably to have been welcomed onto the ark had they taken this seriously. But everything that listens to God survives. Everything that doesn't is wiped out. Okay, any other observations in 6 and 7 before we move on to 8 and 9?
Mentioning in Hebrews passage talks about his faith of building an ark. Chapter 2 of Genesis says there was no rain up until that point. It was just a mist that sort of helped it out down at the bottom. So the idea is he's over there preaching, saying, there's going to be a great flood, that's what I'm here, you be saved and follow God. And they're looking at him saying, from what? You know,
Right.
There's never rained, how can we have a flood? There's no rain, there's nothing. You know, so his faith was really accentuated, or whatever the word is, you know, by the idea that there was never any rain before this.
Good.
It's like, how can there be a flood? You know, and so anybody that's evil, well, God's going to send it, you know,
Okay.
who's God?
Good.
You
Good.
know?
Yeah, so it really is an important learning opportunity for us about what does faith look like. I think it's also important for evidence reasons. I mean, we talked about kind of the debate that goes along, that goes on between people who will say, well, this is just a local flood, or they'll just say it's mythology. It's really interesting to notice how many other places in Scripture the flood is cited by other writers, including Jesus himself. They don't talk about this as some sort of myth or some sort of like legend or something like that. This is something that they saw as fact. So if we're going to trust their credibility, then that extends to accounts like this. Right, yes, sir.
Not only that, adding on to it, archaeologists have found almost every major society they have found has a recounting of the flood.
Good.
Almost every single one. There are a few exceptions.
Good.
But there are different, and there's a difference on like how many people were saved and everything. But it's to a shocking point. It's like, this couldn't have been some local flood if someone over in South America was also talking about this, if someone in Asia was talking about this, if someone in the Middle East was talking about this, if someone in Europe was talking about this.
Good.
It can't just have been that way.
Yeah, my first semester of college in my World Lit class, one of the first things that we read was Gilgamesh, which is a Babylonian account of the flood, basically. But to your point, you don't have something that shows up that in that many cultures if it's just a local thing that happened in one place. But this is clearly something that impacts the world. Carrie, Isman.
And also, I think it underscores the importance of looking at the beginning of creation, where God gives the account of how it happened and seeing it as real history and not an allegory. Because if you discount that, what about all of these other accounts that come after that? So then you have this fantastic flood. If you discount the 7 days of creation, all of a sudden it gets easier to throw the flood narrative out of the window as well. Maybe that was allegory as well, right?
Right,
So,
right. Where do you draw the line? That's a point well made. Let's see. So after the waters start to subside, getting into chapter 8, Noah sends out 2 animals, 2 birds to kind of survey or surveil the land. What does he send out, in what order, and kind of what happens with both of them? Cindy, yes, ma'am.
The raven first, and it says it went to and fro freely until the waters abated, so I don't know if that means it never came back to Noah, or it landed out there and wouldn't come back in, I don't know. But then the dove went and came back and then went again and brought a little twig.
Good. So the raven, we really don't know what happens other than it just kind of hangs out and does its thing until the waters subside. The dove, we have a little more detail about 3 different 3 different flights that it goes on. The first one, it comes back because it can't find anything. Second one, it comes back and it's got an olive branch in its beak. And then the third time, it doesn't come back. And that's when Noah knows, okay, the earth is dry, it's safe. And so they wait even after that another 7 days, and then they leave the Great. Let's see. So, did I miss a hand? Somebody have stand.
I was going to mention about the flood. All the fountains of the great deep were opened up, and we've got mountains that are 4 or 7 miles high, and those were all covered. So all the water, just from the rain, goes through from the springs of water. So that was really covering quite a bit of territory. I'm probably saying it wrong, but anyway, a lot of water came up real fast.
Okay, good. And it would have to cover that amount of ground. There's a lot of really fascinating, if any of you are interested in kind of the science of this or people that have studied evidence for this, there's a lot of really fascinating things to consider. If any of you want more information about that, talk to me afterwards and I can give you some references, but that's good to consider. Tim and Scott.
You may be saying the same thing, but in verse 11 it says, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So the waters came from beneath too, and that explains a lot of, if you go out west and you see so many formations and different things, and they claim this happened by water. And it's like something like the Grand Canyon and things of that nature happened by water. There was a great flood. It's evident almost from the naked eye. And then if you've ever toured the Ark in Kentucky that they have built as a replica, they explain a lot of the climatic change. And, our atheist world says, where is the Ice Age? Well, it's very probable that it caused climatic change in the flood that would be comparable to what society and atheists call the Ice Age. So many anomalies and abnormalities that happened because of the flood.
Good. Scott?
Yeah, just one more thing on that apologetic rabbit trail. We're finding out that there's probably a huge body of water near the Earth's core. There's water down there. And so when the Bible says fountains of the deep, that's probably what it's referring to.
Good. So there's a lot, I won't comment any further on any of that, but there's a lot of good information available to kind of support this. Let's talk about the aftermath. So they come off of the flood. God makes a covenant with mankind. There are these parallels with chapters 1 and 2. A lot of what God did in chapter 1 to create the world, he does again in chapters 8 and 9 to sort of recreate it. You have similar images of like the Spirit moving over the surface of the waters to kind of dry things out or bring life back. Keep in mind again why this would be important in context. The readers of this originally, this is the generation that's coming out of the wilderness and getting ready to go into the Promised Land. What they need to be reminded of is God's ability to create from nothing, because that's really what they came from. That's who they were. They were this fledgling nation that God had birthed in Egypt, delivered miraculously, provided for them in their infancy, and now he's bringing them up into adolescence and adulthood. And these would just be really, really vital reminders to them of God's ability to create them into exactly what he wants them to be, but also the importance of listening to him and not getting caught up in the nations around them and the influence around them, because that would result in the kind of judgment that we see in chapter 6. Now, one thing I want to point out here is this covenant that God makes with mankind in chapter 8. There are 3 promises that God makes at the end of chapter 8. He makes a promise to not curse the ground in verse 21. He makes a promise to never again destroy every living thing. And then he makes a promise that earth and seed and harvest and the seasons and all those things will continue. When Noah comes off the ark, what stands out to you? What does he do? And what does that indicate to you? Let's see, Anita, ladies first.
He builds an altar and makes sacrifices.
Okay, so he offers sacrifices to God, builds an altar and offers sacrifices. What's the takeaway for us? Anything significant? Is that just a detail?
I think Thanksgiving, he's from the family of Seth, who were people that walked after God, and it seems like he's remembered that.
Okay, good. So you have this idea of deliverance, and that prompts sacrifice. I think that's it's one of those concepts that should be ingrained in every fiber of our being. When we understand what God has done, it prompts worship, it prompts sacrifice, it prompts us to come to Him with gratitude. That's the only reasonable response. In terms of the covenant that God makes, He gives a sign of this covenant. And what is the sign?
Rainbow.
Okay, a rainbow. The word for this in Hebrew is a word that they use for like bows and arrow bows, like instruments of war, weapons. So it's fascinating that the symbol that God puts in the sky is related to all of the things that He used to make war against mankind, like rain and all this other stuff. And now, whenever it rains, He puts this weapon in the sky to remind us that I'm not gonna do this to you again. Now, while we're talking about this idea of the covenant, one of the things that's interesting here too is the first place that word shows up is back in chapter 6. Look quickly at chapter 6, verse 18. This is, of course, before the flood, but God says, I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So God tells Noah that He's going to establish the covenant, but He doesn't actually make the covenant until they're off of the ark, like in chapters 8 and 9 with the sacrifice and the rainbow and all that stuff. Do you think there's any significance to the order of that? The fact that God says, I'm going to make a covenant, but then He doesn't make it until after He's done some things for Noah and his family. Are there any other places in Scripture where you can think of God doing a similar thing, where He predicts or He tells about a covenant He's going to make, but He doesn't make it until after He does some things to lead up to that? Right? Okay, Abraham, can you elaborate on that?
All three of the promises are given to Abraham.
Okay.
All three of them. The land He isn't given until after Egypt. He bought it from Egypt. His great nation He doesn't see it. Because it's not until really after Egypt that the nation has become a really, really big people.
Okay.
And then the seed promise in Christ, well, no shocking saw that one. Because
Okay.
It wasn't until like 2,000 years later see that.
So God telling Abraham in several cases that He's going to do things that Abraham's never really going to see, which raises the question: then why tell Abraham? Like, what's the value of that? Let me just throw that out there. Bruce?
Well, I would think that Sarah, Hannah, Mary, God tells him, you're going to have a child. There's going to be some things done before that. And, especially Sarah doesn't believe that. Hannah's hoping for it. Mary hasn't a clue what's going to happen. But, He helps them with their faith, and then they realize that that's happening.
Okay. So this is not out of character for God to say He's going to do something and then He does it. Obviously, there are faith-building aspects to that. I think God does that not because He needs us to make the preparations. Oh, God said He's going to do it, so let me get everything in order. I think He's doing this so that we'll know when it happens, hey, He knew that was going to happen. God knows the future. He knows exactly what He's going to do, and He keeps His word, so I can trust Him. So whether you're talking about one of those women or you're talking about Abraham or any of those instances, what God does in communicating ahead of time what He's going to do is it's one of the hallmarks of deity. In fact, in the prophets He says, I'm God who declares the end from the beginning. Like way back here before it ever happens, I'm going to tell you how it's going to happen so that you'll know who I am. Nobody else can do that. Bruce, yes, sir.
And all through Jesus' ministry, he's telling the disciples, I'm telling you this now, so that when it happens,
Sure.
you will know that I was who I said I was.
Very good. Very good. So think about that as it relates to a couple of other covenants. He does the same thing with Israel in Egypt. Before they ever get to Sinai, before they ever get the law, before that covenant is ever ratified, he delivers them from slavery. And I think the idea here is by the time they get to Mount Sinai and God's like, okay, do you want to be in this covenant with me? They're like, of course, like, what are we going to say? No? I mean, it's like the biggest no-brainer ever. God does the same thing for us. What he's done before we ever enter this covenant with him is the same thing he did for Noah, the same thing he did for Israel. He gives the deliverance and makes that possible. So that when he comes to the table and says, hey, here's my covenant, I want you to be a part of this with me. We've already seen his power. We've already seen his love. We've already seen what God can do. So that it really, for us, should be a no-brainer of a decision. Like, I see what God has, how much he's already invested in this. And I see from what he's said he's going to do and what he's done, his power to be faithful and to do what he says he's going to do for me. So, yes, I want to be in this covenant. I think those are things that should help us with our relationship with God as well. So we have just a couple minutes left. Any other observations from these chapters that you want to touch on that we haven't talked about? Bruce, yes, sir.
It seems interesting in verse 1 of chapter 8, after the flood and everything, it says God remembered Noah. I don't think God forgot about Noah and everything, but it's kind of like there's other things going on besides the flood that God's working on and getting things ready, for when this happens.
Okay. Very good. So you see a number of things there. God not just remembering in terms of needing to, or forgetting that Noah was staying on the ark, but his faithfulness. Very good. Artie? Yes, sir.
We talked a little bit earlier about all the different cultures, and like you mentioned the Gilgamesh writings and stuff like that. It's funny how non-believers, if they would find something like that to back up their theories that didn't go along with the Bible, they would say it was proof. But when you have all that, they say, well, the Bible just stole that from all these other made-up stories.
Right.
So it's just funny how, on anything else, they'll go, oh, that's proof. But they won't use it as proof because it agrees with the Bible.
The funny thing about that is that it still doesn't address the fact that whichever of these stories came first, if you're going to say, okay, well, Gilgamesh was older than the Bible, which I'm not convinced of that anyway, but you still have to explain the fact that all these cultures still have this story. Where does that come from? Like, this isn't the kind of story that people are just going to make up out of thin air, that there was a flood that, destroyed the planet and one person happened to survive it somehow. There has to be something to that explanation. Okay. One thing I did want to bring out in chapter 9 is some of the differences after the flood. There are a few things that are different in the world after the flood. One of the differences is that now food is not just plants, but all the animals are fair game. No pun intended. Or maybe it was intended, whatever. So now, basically, humans can eat anything, at least at this point. Now that's going to change for Israel later on. Anita?
And you'll notice he says, and now the animals fear me.
Yeah.
Whereas before,
good for them.
they were friendly.
Right. It's like, you get off the ark, something changed, man. Noah is not the same guy that he was when we came up to him. So let's get out of here. Yeah, so they saw the writing on the wall, and they figured out something was different too. Another thing that's interesting is there's allowance for retribution that God introduces in chapter 9, verse 6. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. It's interesting that God places parameters that serve as deterrents against the spread of evil.
Now, I don't know if he did that, if those were there in place before and we just don't read about them, but it's interesting that if the reason that the flood happened in the first place was because everybody was just more and more evil, that one of the first things God does after Noah and his family come off the ark is he puts deterrents in place to say, you got to treat each other better. Like the way that you were living before and the things you were doing before, that's going to come with consequence. And if you do this to someone, you're going to be removed from the planet so that it doesn't spread. I don't want to remove the whole planet like I did at the flood, but I will remove you individually if you don't, if you engage in this kind of behavior. So it's interesting to see some of that too. I think we're out of time. Yeah. Okay. So now for the big finale for next week, we're going to cover chapters 10 through 15. We're spending 2 weeks to cover 3 lessons, okay? We've got to do that because we have 12 weeks to cover 13 lessons, and I don't want to skip later stuff in Genesis. So next week, chapters 10 through 15, and then the week after that, we're going to do 16 through 21. So get ready. We're going to cover a lot of ground, but you have your warning, so prepare accordingly. Thanks, everybody.